The letter trembled in Sarah's hands as she read the final words her grandmother had written before death took her. The paper was thick, handmade from pulped cedar, grandmother's signature touch. Even now, 3 days after the funeral, it carried the scent of sweetgrass and sage. When the Skadegamutc comes, little one, you'll know it by the silence. Birds stop singing, wind stops whispering. Even your own heart seems to pause between beats. That's when you must be strongest. That's when you must remember who you are. Sarah folded the letter along its worn creases and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Outside her grandmother's cabin, pine branches swayed against a charcoal sky, their shadows dancing across weathered floorboards. She'd spent 15 years building a life in Boston, constructing careful walls between herself and the reservation's old ways. Now, sitting in her grandmother's rocking chair, those walls felt paper-thin. Her fingers traced the familiar notches in the chair's armrest, 4 parallel lines, deep and deliberate. As a child, she'd believed her grandmother's story about making them to ward off evil spirits. As an adult with a PhD in cultural anthropology, she'd classified them as fascinating examples of indigenous protective symbolism. But tonight, they felt like something else entirely. Something waiting. The kitchen timer chimed, making her jump. Sarah laughed at her own nervousness, the sound too loud in the empty cabin. The tea her grandmother had specifically requested she drink on this night, the third after burial, was ready. The mixture of herbs filled the small space with an unfamiliar scent, neither pleasant nor repulsive, but undeniably potent. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, pushing herself up from the rocking chair. "You're a rational person, Sarah. A scholar. Not some." The word superstitious died on her lips as she caught her reflection in the window. For a moment, just a moment, she could have sworn her grandmother stood behind her, lips moving in silent warning. Sarah spun around. The cabin was empty, save for the shadows and the steam rising from her cup. But as she reached for the tea with trembling hands, a sudden silence fell over the world outside. The constant whisper of pine needles ceased. The distant cry of a loon cut off mid-call. Even the old cabin's familiar creaks and sighs stilled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In her pocket, her grandmother's letter seemed to burn against her skin. Sarah's modern mind supplied rational explanations. Pressure changes before a storm, coincidental timing, her own exhaustion and grief playing tricks. But something deeper, something that spoke in her grandmother's voice, whispered a different truth. The silence deepened, and Sarah realized her own heart had indeed paused between beats, just as the letter had warned. In that eternal moment, she had to choose. Reach for the tea that represented everything she'd left behind, or turn away from her heritage one final time. The shadows in the corner began to move against the wind. Sarah's hand closed around the warm ceramic mug. The rational part of her mind, the part that had earned tenure at 35, cataloged the herbs she could identify. Sweetgrass, sage, cedar, and others her grandmother had taught her before she'd fled to college. Before the night she'd seen. No, she wouldn't think about that now. She lifted the mug to her lips, the steam-carrying memories of summer days spent gathering plants, of her grandmother's weathered hands showing her how to strip bark without harming the tree, of stories told around fires that seemed to burn in colors she'd never seen anywhere else. The first sip burned, not with heat, but with something deeper. Sarah gasped, nearly dropping the mug. The liquid seemed to move of its own accord, down her throat, spreading warmth that felt like whispered words in a language she'd spent years trying to forget. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Sarah set down the mug with shaking hands. Through the window, she could see Gerald Whitefeather, the tribal elder who'd spoken at her grandmother's funeral. His face was grave in the growing darkness. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said when she opened the door. "Not after what happened to Michael." Sarah's chest tightened. "Michael? Michael Windrunner? What happened to him?" Gerald's eyes darted to the shadows behind her. "Found this morning behind his house, just like the others. They say," he hesitated, "they say the marks were the same as 20 years ago, 4 parallel lines, deep in the chest, just like your father." The world tilted beneath Sarah's feet. She grabbed the doorframe for support, memories she'd buried flooding back. Her father's body in the snow, the impossible tracks leading away, her grandmother's face as she performed ceremonies through the night while 8-year-old Sarah huddled beneath quilts that couldn't keep out the cold. "That's not possible," she whispered. "They said it was a bear attack. I've read the police reports." Gerald shook his head slowly. "Your grandmother protected you from the truth. But she's gone now. 3 deaths in 3 days. You're the last of your grandmother's line, Sarah, the last who can take her place." "Take her place? I don't even believe in—" The words caught in her throat as movement flickered in her peripheral vision. Something dark and fluid, like smoke but more substantial, curled around Gerald's shoulders. He showed no sign of noticing, but Sarah felt her breath freeze in her lungs. "Your grandmother left you something, didn't she?" Gerald pressed. "Something for tonight?" The tea. Sarah's eyes darted to the mug on the table, still steaming despite the minutes that had passed. The shadows seemed to recoil from its faint glow. "You have to decide tonight," Gerald continued. "The barrier between worlds is thinnest now, 3 days after a death. Your grandmother knew that. Why do you think she made you promise to come back specifically today?" Sarah hadn't told anyone about that promise, not even at the funeral. She took a step back from the door, her mind racing. Gerald knew too much, yet not enough. The real Gerald Whitefeather had been in the hospital for weeks. She'd visited him yesterday. Which meant the thing wearing Gerald's face smiled, too wide, too sharp. "Smart girl," it said in a voice that was no longer entirely human. "You always were, just like your grandmother." Sarah slammed the door, but shadow smoke seeped through the gaps around the frame. She backed away, her hand finding the letter in her pocket. More words revealed themselves now, written in her grandmother's blood, invisible until needed. "The tea will open your eyes, the truth will set you free, but only if you choose it." Choice. It always came back to choice. The shadow smoke gathered, taking shape, tall, gaunt, with antlers that scraped the ceiling and eyes that burned like frozen stars. The Skadegamutc in its true form, just as the stories described. Just as she'd seen 20 years ago, watching through her bedroom window as it faced her grandmother in the snow. Sarah's back hit the table. The mug of tea was warm against her fingers. "You abandoned your heritage," the creature said in a voice like wind through bare branches. "Ran from your responsibility. But power doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It festers, grows wild. People die." "Like my father?" Sarah's voice shook, but she kept her eyes locked on the creature's burning gaze. "Like Michael?" They were warnings, reminders. Your grandmother understood the price of maintaining balance. Someone must stand between worlds. Someone must keep the old ways. Without her— It gestured to the shadows that now filled most of the cabin. The barriers fade. Things come through. Sarah's fingers tightened around the mug. She thought of her life in Boston, her research, her students, her carefully constructed worldview where everything had a rational explanation. She thought of her grandmother, standing night after night in the snow, keeping watch, keeping safe. The tea was still warm. "If I drink this," she said, "if I accept, will the death stop?" The creature's smile showed too many teeth. "That depends on you, on how strong you are, on whether you're worthy of your grandmother's power." Sarah closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw 2 paths stretching before her, one leading back to Boston, to safety and certainty and science, the other leading into shadow and mystery, to a world where stories were more than stories and power came with a price. But she saw something else too. Her father's smile, her grandmother's strength, generations of women and men who'd stood in the dark and kept watch, knowing the cost but choosing to pay it anyway. She opened her eyes and lifted the mug to her lips. The tea tasted of earth and stars and stories told in firelight. As she swallowed the last drop, the world shifted, reality peeling back like old wallpaper to reveal the truth beneath. The Skadegamutc was still there, but now she saw it clearly. Not just a monster, but a necessary darkness, a balance point between worlds, just as her grandmother had been a necessary light, just as she would be now. "I remember who I am," Sarah said, her voice carrying echoes of her grandmother's strength. The shadows rippled in response, and somewhere in the distance a loon resumed its cry. The wind returned, carrying the scent of pine and possibilities. The Skadegamutc bowed its antlered head. "Then let us begin." Sarah stood straighter, feeling power flow through her veins like starlight. She wasn't running anymore. She was home, standing where she belonged, between worlds and ways, finding balance in the space between what was and what could be. Outside, the night waited, full of shadows and stories and truths that could no longer be denied. Sarah stepped forward to meet it, carrying her grandmother's strength and her father's smile and 15 years of learning how to bridge worlds. She had chosen, and in choosing, she was finally free.